So I'm going to tell you a story, a personal story about my life. Kim's going to hate this story. I told her she would love it last night, but she's not going to like it. Yeah, it's about me. Yeah, I know. You were there. So it was December of 2000. Yeah, if you don't know, anytime I mention Kim in a message, she gets a massage. That's our deal. So 2008, December of 2008, we are on a cruise celebrating our college graduation. And one of the excursions that we did, you know I'm going to talk about already, was this. Okay, we did a sailboat for a day. We did a sailboat trip for a day. We had a local guy from the islands who had a sailboat, and that's how he made money. It's a pretty cool job to sail around with people and make money. It's cool. So we did that for the day. It was cool. We went to a private island for lunch, and so one thing that I'll never forget, and Kim will never forget as much as she wants to, is one of the stops on our trip was to Stingray Island or Stingray City or whatever it's called, where you can go pet the stingrays and everything. So to do this, and you wouldn't think much of this, but I'll tell you why it's important for me in just a second. To get here, he had to kind of anchor away from the shore, and you have to jump out and swim over to the place where the stingrays are, which is fine unless you're like me and you can't swim. Since then, I've learned enough to possibly save my life, but at the time, couldn't swim at all. So here we are in the Caribbean. We're jumping out of a sailboat, and I have a life jacket on that I didn't realize was not on very well. It was kind of too big, and it was actually going to kill me, right? So I reluctantly kind of jump off the side, and immediately I'm going under because the life jacket is not working as it should. And so I'm like, this is it. This is how I'm going to die. At least I'm going to go from one paradise to another immediately. It's, could be worse. And so I'm obviously flailing for my life. I'm going to die before I get to the stingrays. I'm going to die. And so, Kim comes over and she tries to help me. And then John Paul, the guide, he came over and helped me and basically saved my life, pulled me to safety. And so I've never touched water since. I haven't bathed or anything since that moment. I was so terrified. But Kim remembers that moment. She was like, I had never seen such panic on a person's face in my life. And I can imagine how I must have looked thinking I'm going to die. And so I tell that story because Jonah finds himself in this same exact moment at the end of Jonah chapter 1. We're in week 3 of this series on the book of Jonah, talking about the prophet Jonah in the Old Testament. And so we're going to do a quick recap, and then we'll pick it up where we left off last week. So Jonah is a prophet. God calls him to go to a city called Nineveh and preach against their wickedness. Jonah decides he doesn't want to do that, so he runs the other way. So he hops on board of a boat to go to a different city as far away from the one he's called to as he can. And while he's on the boat, the Bible says that God caused a great storm to come upon this boat in the middle of the sea, so much so they thought the boat was going to break apart into pieces. And so then the sailors on board who are not Jewish people, they don't believe in God, they pray to their own gods for help, and they're not answering. Jonah's on the bottom of the boat asleep, and so they wake him up. They say, hey, pray to your God. Maybe he'll save us. They have a conversation. They realize, they discover that the purpose of the storm is because Jonah's running from God. And they're like, what do we do to stop the storm? And Jonah says, well, the only answer is to throw me overboard. If you do that, then God will stop the storm. So they throw him overboard, and the storm stops immediately on the boat. But Jonah finds himself in the middle of the sea, which is not, it's just come off a storm. It's still turbulent. There's still waves, and he is not doing so hot. And so then let's pick it up here. Jonah chapter 1, verse 17. Here's the most famous part of the story of Jonah. What happens next is amazing. It says this: now the Lord had arranged for a great fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Again, one of the most famous stories ever is the story of Jonah from the Bible. Even if you didn't grow up in church, you probably heard about this story at some point. And this is the part we all know. Jonah and the whale is usually what it's called, even though it says a great fish. It doesn't say whale. Maybe it was a shark. It probably wasn't a baby shark. Anybody know that? Yeah, it probably wasn't that. Now it's in your head all day. You're welcome. If you don't know it, YouTube it. Then it'll be in your head all day. You're welcome. So a great fish, a huge fish, swallows Jonah. And that's where chapter 1, all of these events have happened in one chapter. In 17 verses, all this action happens. And so here we are at the beginning of chapter 2. But before we get to that, I want to get geeky for just a couple minutes. Is that okay if we do that? I want to get geeky for just a minute because I want to ask a question that has nothing to do with the actual words on the page, but about the story in general, the story of Jonah. And that question is this: did this story actually happen? And you would think, well, yeah, it's in the Bible. Let me just surprise you and maybe disappoint you and upset you. Please don't leave until I'm finished. But many, if not most, biblical scholars who study the Bible, love the Bible, believe the Bible will tell you it is likely this story is not an actual historical event. Most biblical scholars that study the Bible and love the Bible and believe the Bible for themselves would say it is highly likely, almost 100% possible, probable, likely, that the story of Jonah is not an actual historical event. This did not actually take place. Don't be disappointed. That's just what they say. Here's what we know about the Bible. It's an ancient document, thousands of years old, from a culture halfway around the world, written in ancient foreign languages. There is a lot to the Bible that we in our English version in 21st century America do not see on the page. But as we know it and understand it, it's important. It helps us understand the Bible more. This is the kind of the hard work that we don't normally do, but trying to study the culture behind what's written in the Bible, the context behind what's written in the Bible is important. Because sometimes, and you might have some of these items in your home, like on coffee mugs or bookmarks. Like one verse from the Bible, there may not really be what you think it means, right? There's context surrounding that. The only exception really might be Proverbs, where most of them are one verse, and that's it. But the story of Jonah, you can't just necessarily take even one verse. It's not going to make sense without the surrounding context. So as much as we kind of don't like to hear what we're going to talk about for the next 5 or 6 minutes, it's important that we understand that that's just how the Bible is. It's not just one type of literature. It's many types of literature. So most scholars would say this story probably is not an actual historical event. One author that I read a few weeks ago, he equated it to this. He said, in his estimation, he would equate the story of Jonah to a sketch on a comedy show. That's the way in which it's written. And he would say, again, you have to understand ancient Hebrew to see the humor in what goes on, especially in chapter 1. You have to know ancient cultures to understand how they would interpret this story. And so he gives a couple examples. So he talks about in chapter 1, when God tells Jonah, arise and go to Nineveh, and then it says Jonah got up and went the other way. He says that word arise in Hebrew and that word for get up are two different words off by just one single letter. So when you're reading this in Hebrew, you're going to see some humor in that. He got really close to doing what God said, but instead he did the exact opposite. They would see humor. We're like, Jonah, you're terrible, you're running, but they would be laughing at this point already. That's the opening joke of the story of Jonah for the original reader. And then he talks about Jonah was called to go east by land, and instead he went west by sea. Again, we just see that as, oh, he's a bad boy, he's being disobedient. But this is piling on the jokes for the ancient reader. The original reader whom this was intended for in that culture is going to see humor in what's going on so far. He almost did what God said, but really he did the exact opposite. They're going to be kind of rolling on the floor laughing at this point, which we don't see that. The other thing that is, so that the humor that we just don't see piles on, because when he's on the boat in the storm, the pagan sailors are praying and Jonah's asleep. They're going to be like, that's ironic. Well, that's it. That's kind of a kicker right there. They're going to see things in this that we don't understand. So again, we're already missing out on so much by not knowing the culture and the context that really makes this come out. The other thing that is interesting is the boat itself in Jonah chapter 1 is a character in the story originally in the ancient Hebrew text. The way in which the author of the book of Jonah describes the ship gives it a personality. If you look, it says the ship was about to break apart. If you look at it word for word in the Hebrew, it's saying the ship was trying to decide whether or not to break apart. So they would see, whoa, this is getting really weird really fast, and we just don't see anything with that. So all that to say this, the fact that it may or may not be an actual story is shown in these sort of details. The way in which the author writes the story is with intention. He's making plays. He's making play on words. He's making jokes. He's making intimations here that the original audience is going to be, this is a comedy, and we're like, this is a tragedy. So it's going to really change the way in which we see the story. And honestly, when you look at the events, and I'll describe them very quickly here in just a second, it almost looks like an improv comedy sketch for sure. And I've mentioned this before in a different context, but it makes sense here. One of the rules, if you want to learn improv comedy rules, I've got one for you right now. If you were curious, you just write this down, okay? Very spiritual this morning. One of the rules in improv comedy, when you're making up a story with a group of people, it's called yes and. So as a team of improv comedians, you're going to keep building on the story to make it as crazy as possible. And so whenever someone says something that doesn't make any sense at all, you can't shut it down and start a new story. Your job as part of this comedy team is to build on it. It's the yes and rule. If you look at the events of Jonah, you can see the author doing that here. So let's go from the beginning. God calls Jonah, but Jonah runs. Well, why would he do that? I don't want to continue that story. Well, so then after that, the storm comes, and then after the storm, Jonah's thrown overboard as the only option. We're just building on the craziness of the story here. And then in verse 17, when he's out in the sea, a fish swallows him. That sounds like something that someone would make up. It sounds like a story that a comedy team would invent. Who would think of that? A guy in the sea is swallowed by a fish? Not only is he swallowed by the fish, but in chapter 2, we discover he's not even dead. You would think if you're swallowed by a fish, you're going to be dead, but not in this story, not Jonah. No, we're going to get crazy with this story. We're going to get hilarious with this story by Jonah being alive inside of a fish, a human alive inside of a fish for 3 days. So we see here that it's possible, and really most Bible scholars would tell you we should view the story of Jonah as a parable, an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. Now, here's the thing. Jesus told a couple dozen parables, and we love him for it. He told cool stories, and we love them. But normally, when we look at the view of Jonah as a parable, we're like, whoa, you don't love the Bible anymore. You don't trust the Bible. It's like, no, there's different types of literature. It's not just one thing, not just one way to look at the Bible. And when we do, that's a dangerous thing to do. Now, let me just say this. It is also possible that this is a historical account. It is possible. Why? Because there's lots of miraculous events in the Bible, right? This is just, if this actually was a real person who was really swallowed by a fish, that would be normal for the Bible. Because if Jesus can raise people from the dead, then someone could live inside of a fish for 3 days. It's not that much of a stretch. Do you see where I'm going with this? So is it possible? Yes. Is it probable? I would say not. But here's the key. No matter which way you look at this story, it doesn't change the value of the story. No matter which way you view how this story is, whether it happened or not, you can believe either one of these and still love the Bible, okay? So you can believe it didn't happen. It's still inspired. God still thought, hey, this parable about this prophet named Jonah, that'd be pretty neat to put right in the middle of the Old Testament. There's a lot of lessons to learn here from this story. That's what a parable does. It teaches us lessons about life and spirituality and our faith. So God thought enough of this story, whether it happened or not, to put it in inspired scripture. So it still has value. There are still lessons to learn either way you look at this. It doesn't have to be real to have value. It doesn't have to be an actual event for us to find meaning in it. And here's the main key, and then I'll move off of this and we'll get into chapter 2. But I feel like this was important to cover, just to look at how the Bible is not as simple as we sometimes make it out to be. And I think God did that by design. So it's important that we see that not only is God higher than we can understand, sometimes what he says and how he says it through the Bible is the same way. It's not just, we can't just read it surface level and be like, oh, that was cool, that was neat. There's more that God wants us to understand about the words that he's saying. So whatever side of this you're on, here's my encouragement, and that is to respect the other side of that stance. And I shouldn't have to say that, but in our culture today, I feel like I must. In our culture that is polarized about everything, when I make a statement like what I've just made and explained it like I just have, I feel like I still need to say, respect the other side. So if you're on the opinion, oh, of course that this didn't happen, the parable thing makes sense, don't look at people that believed it happened as idiots. Well, these people, they'll believe anything. If they believe this person was really swallowed by a real whale and lived, then they're dumb. No. And if you're on the side that believes it was an actual historical event, this story of Jonah actually happened, don't look at people on the other side and say, well, they don't believe the Bible. They don't love God as much as I do. They just don't have God kind of faith that I have. So that we don't want to have that. This shouldn't cause division. It should help us to explore more about Scripture. It should sort of whet our appetite for, I wonder what else the Bible has to say. I wonder what else maybe I've thought that maybe I should look at a second or third time. So there is value to looking at some of the hard, uncomfortable type of questions that are necessary to look at when it comes to Scripture. So let's look then at chapter 2, and the story of Jonah, as we see here, is all about one key word. Really, one of the main themes of the story of Jonah is grace. God's grace. So we're going to look at a few things regarding God's grace as we look through chapter 2 for just a few minutes this morning. Here, I just want to kind of start with a sort of what I'd call a working definition of God's grace. And the best way to explain it is this. God's grace is about saving us. It's a pretty good thing. I mean, that's what grace is. Sort of a second chance, sort of overlooking fault, failure. That's what the idea of grace really at the root is all about. So what I want to do is read Jonah chapter 2 in its entirety. It's only 9 verses, I think. And what it is it's a prayer. So Jonah's in the open sea. God causes a whale to consume him. And while he's inside the belly of a whale, he decides it's a good time to pray. I got nothing else to do. Got lots of time on my hands. Kind of desperate in this weird situation I'm in. Maybe I should pray about it. Maybe I should ask God some stuff. Maybe I should come clean to some stuff and just kind of let God know what I'm thinking while I'm inside the guts of a fish. Let's do that. So here's what happens. Jonah chapter 2, starting at verse number 1. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from inside the fish. He said, I cried out to the Lord in my great trouble, and he answered me. I called to you from the land of the dead, and Lord, you heard me. You threw me into the ocean depths, and I sank down to the heart of the sea. The mighty waters engulfed me. I was buried beneath your wild and stormy waves. Then I said, O Lord, you have driven me from your presence, yet I will look once more toward your holy temple. I sank beneath the waves, and the waters closed over me. Seaweed wrapped itself around my head. I love that imagery. A seaweed turban. He's very fashionable, Jonah. I sank down to the very roots of the mountains. I was imprisoned in the earth, whose gates lock shut forever. But you, O Lord my God, snatched me from the jaws of death. And he used jaws to do it, right? Yeah, that was a joke. All right, as my life was slipping, tough crowd. I remembered the Lord, and my earnest prayer went out to you in your holy temple. Those who worship false gods turn their backs on all God's mercies. But I will offer sacrifices to you with songs of praise, and I will fulfill all my vows. For my salvation comes from the Lord alone. So this prayer, believe it or not, is about God's grace. And it's complicated, and we'll get to why that is before we're done here today. But this prayer is a prayer of thanksgiving. It's a song of praise to God. While he's in the belly of a fish, he's deciding it's a good time to thank God for how great my life is right now. So there you go. So God's grace is about saving us, but what it saves us from is really the key to grace. God's grace is not just about saving us from our sin, although that's what it is. It's not just about saving us from these problems that we have, but the essence, the core, the heart of God's grace is about saving us from ourselves. Because the problem that I have is not my problems, it's me. The issues that I have are not these sins that I have an issue. The problem is me. And so that's what Jonah realizes here is many times I am my own worst enemy. As much as we would like to blame Satan for a lot of our problems, if we're honest, many of them are self-inflicted wounds. Now, he does tempting and he tries to wear us down, and that's true, but he can't make you do anything. No one can. So I am my own worst enemy. My poor decision-making causes problems. My selfishness is self-destructive. My disobedience has me sinking in the open sea of life many times. If I want to look at the main source of my problems and issues and hang-ups, I need to hold up a mirror, because that's where most of them come from. And Jonah sees that here to some degree. I won't get into a lot of details because I don't want to speak for the next 3 hours. I'm not like Infinity War here, okay? I'm not Endgame. I'm not going to go for 3 hours. But the best prayer that we can pray, and really any prayer of salvation, is not simply, God, save me from my sin, or save me from my issues or from my problems, but really the most basic prayer is, God, save me from myself. God, rescue me from me. That's really what Jonah is trying to do here. He doesn't quite get it all the way, as we'll see in the next couple of weeks. But we want to really, again, the story of Jonah is not be like Jonah. It's be better than Jonah. Be the opposite of Jonah. So if we're going to pray a prayer like that, let's really mean it with all of our heart. Let's really be ready to do the work that it takes through the power of the Holy Spirit to accomplish that in our lives. And here's the next key about God's grace, is that we never see the true reality of God's grace until we see our need for it. We never see the true reality of God's grace until we see our own need for it. And I looked at that term, true reality, and I thought, well, I don't really need both of those words. It's kind of redundant, isn't it? But there is fake reality. There is false reality. It's called reality TV, right? Okay? There's very little about reality TV that's real. Some of it is scripted, like by design. They have producers and writers that help the story along. They edit things in a certain way to make things appear that they happen, but they really didn't go that way. They speed up events because, again, if you're a camera crew following a person, even if they're interesting, they're going to have really boring days. So you're going to cut that out. But that's their reality. Half of their life is just sitting at a desk at work. Half of their life is asleep. I don't want to film that because that's creepy. We don't want to do that anyway. But so even reality TV is not real. Even the way that we look at and perceive our own lives, sometimes we can fool ourselves into an alternate reality or a false reality. And so we never see the true reality of God's grace until we see our need for it. Look at Jonah again, chapter 2, verse 7. Here's what he says. As my life was slipping away, I remembered the Lord, and my earnest prayer went out to you in your holy temple. You talk about waiting until the last minute to see your need for grace. That's about as last minute as it can get. My life was slipping away. Have you ever waited till the last minute to do something before, or you procrastinate, right? We do it all the time. We wait till the last minute. You wait until you're really, really, really lost to get the directions on your phone. Like, I've been around this 3 times, and that's not where I'm trying to go. Okay, Siri, okay, Google, tell me where to go now. We wait till we're late for our appointment, till we look for directions. We tend to do that sometimes. Or maybe when you are in school, or if you are in school, you procrastinate on a project or a paper, and then it's like the day before, and you ask your teacher for an extension. Like, well, you've had 2 months to do this. It's not that hard. You're like, I know, but I waited till the last minute, and now I need help, that kind of thing. Or you do this with your kids. I'm going to count to 3, and you better get over here right now. And you go 1, 2, 2 1/4, 2 1/2, 2 3/4, 2, because they're not coming yet, and so they wait till the last. They're going to wait till it's like 2 99/100ths before they start walking toward you. They wait till the last possible second to do what they know to do. We do it all the time. So Jonah waits until he is literally on the brink of death to see his need for help. To see, there might be a problem here. I might have really gotten myself in a pickle this time, didn't I, Jonah? Yeah, I probably did. And then at the last possible second, he sees his need for grace. Because before that moment, about to drown in the open sea, he hasn't seen that yet. Why? He's a prophet of God. He's called by God. Why would he need God's grace for anything? No, he doesn't need that. Even when he disobeyed God and ran the opposite direction of God's call, he had justification for it. He didn't see what he was doing was wrong, and even if he did, he had a reason for it. He didn't need God's grace in that. He was fine. He had reasons. And even when he's in the sea, he probably thought he was going to be okay, And there might have been a second, like we talked about last week, maybe jumping over or being thrown overboard wasn't a death wish. So maybe he thought, oh, this is fine, everything's fine. And then at the very last second, when he's taking in that last gulp of water, he's like, okay, wait, okay, stop. So he didn't see it till the very last second. And here's the question that we need to ask ourselves is, do we see our need for grace in our lives? So obviously, if you're apart from a relationship with God, whether you realize it or not, you are in need of grace. You're in need of God's forgiveness to cover your sin. That's what grace does. It covers our sin. Maybe you're kind of a newer Christian. You're in need of grace. You're in need of God helping you to navigate what this Christian life looks like. It's new. It's difficult. It's rocky terrain. There's twists and turns that we weren't expecting, and there's surprises around certain corners. You need God's grace to help fill in the gaps for you. You need God's grace to carry you sometimes from point A to point B when you don't know what to do or how to get there. Even those of us in the room who we would say, I've been a Christian for a long time, we have the possibility, unfortunately, of being much like Jonah was. We don't recognize our need continually for God's grace. Because I don't know about you, but I'm still a work in progress. And I don't know about you, but I still have issues that I haven't worked through completely yet. And I don't know about you, but I have things that I need God's grace to cover in my life. Do I love Him? Yes. Do I try to serve Him? Yes. Do I aim to be obedient in all that I say and do and am? Yes. But I don't always do that. So I need God's grace to help me. We never outgrow our need for grace. It's not just a one-time prayer, God save me and then I'm good. That's just the beginning of a lifelong journey that is God's grace. So I pray that we would remain aware of our frailty, of our humanness, so that we always are aware of our need for God's grace. Then there's a question that comes with that, and I'll say it in two different ways so we can try to cover the whole question. What if I don't see my need for God's grace until right at the very end? What if I'm not constantly aware of that and I find myself like Jonah about to die? Maybe not literally, but maybe in every other way that's true. So let me ask this question this way. What if God lets you lose it all in order to find yourself in Him? That's exactly where Jonah is in Jonah chapter 2. He's about to die. He's going to lose literally everything. His life is over. What if God gets us to that point? What will we do? And let me just say this. God will give you what you want in your life. He will let you flail in the open sea. He will let you wander aimlessly apart from Him. That's not what He desires, but He will give us what we think we want. He will allow us to walk away from Him if we so choose. It is our decision, our choice to live how we want. And if it's with Him, then we'll have that grace. And if it's apart from Him in any shape or form or fashion, God will let us flail until we, again, see that need for grace. And it reminds me of the story of the prodigal son, a parable that Jesus tells that we love, like this other parable, the book of Jonah. I get it? See what I'm doing there? So anyway, the story is very, very famous, very simple. There's a father has two sons. The older son is obedient, works for his dad, loves his dad, whatever. The younger son decides, hey, I'm sick of this little town. I'm going to leave. Give me my half of the inheritance and I'm out of here. The father doesn't want his son to do that, but he lets him. So the son wanders off, blows his entire inheritance. He is penniless, he is poor, he is homeless, he is without food. So he finds himself eating slop with pigs, which again is very layered here. For a Jewish person, pigs are unclean. Not only am I around them, I'm eating what they are eating alongside of them. That's a big deal in this story. So he decides, again, he's lost everything. And the scripture, Jesus says he came to his senses and said, I had it way better at home than I do here. Maybe if I go back, my father will take me in and I can be his son again. So he does that. The father welcomes him back, gives him a robe and a ring, and says, my son's returned home. But in the time between the time he left and came home, the father let him live the life he thought he wanted to live. He let him blow his entire wealth, every penny. He let him have this reputation as a partier and this guy who's not very good. He can't handle his money or his liquor or anything else. So his father let him do what he thought he wanted. And then when he came back home, he extended grace to him. God's the same way with you and with me. He will let us wander if that's what we want. He will let us lose everything if that's what we think we want apart from him. But then as we return to him, he offers that grace. And Jesus says it this way in Matthew 16:26. He says, what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? Who cares if you get that dream job but you lose your family in the process? Who cares if you're rich but you push everyone away because you're a jerk and you're lonely with your money? Who cares if you're accomplished if you still feel empty inside? And who cares if you live it up during this life but you're not ready for the next one? That's what Jesus is getting at. This is all just going to be a distant memory in the eternity that is to come. All that seems so real right now is going to be nothing in light of eternity. And so he's saying, be careful what you wish for. Be careful what you live for. Be careful what you think you want, because God will give it to you, but it will end up disappointing you in the end. So he says, God says, if you live your life without me, I'll let you, but I offer to do it with you. God says, if you resist me, I will let you, all the while reaching out for you to come back. God says, if you lose it all on your own, I offer a better way. Come back home. He offers grace. God will let us become desperate until all we can be desperate for is him. So again, the point of the story of Jonah is don't get to that point of desperation. Don't wait until you're literally on death's door, whether literally or figuratively. Don't be like Jonah. See your need for God's grace before you're to that point of desperation. God will extend it to you either way, but it's going to be better for us in the long run to be more aware of that consistently. Here's the next thing. There are a couple more things as we start to wrap it up today about grace. This one might be a little bit confusing, so I'll explain it. Even if grace is sometimes painful, uncomfortable, and messy, it's still grace. I'm going to say it again. Even if grace is sometimes painful, uncomfortable, and messy, it's still grace. You might be, wait. I thought grace was a good thing. Why are you putting these negative words next to grace? That doesn't make any sense. But for Jonah, grace was very much uncomfortable and messy and complicated. Grace is good, but it's not always easy. So let's look at the two forms of grace that Jonah sees here in Jonah chapter 1 and 2. First, and this is weird, the first method of God's grace to Jonah is the storm in the boat. So that's not grace. It is. Because God's grace to Jonah stopped him from running, at least for a moment. Now, was it scary for Jonah? Yeah. Was it dangerous? Yeah. Was it difficult? Yeah. It put his life literally in danger, but it's still a method of God's grace to Jonah. And Jonah sees it this way. If you look at Jonah chapter 2, he says, you threw me into the water, talking about God. Now, wait. God didn't throw him in the water. The sailors on the boat did, right? But Jonah sees this, throw me overboard was your way of getting my attention. It was your way of trying to call me back home, to get me into my right mind. And he says, your waves overtook me. Well, yeah, I can get that. But so he's not, maybe in some way he's trying to blame God for the mess he's in, but at the very least he's seeing that God had a hand in this, and it was really God's grace that even caused this storm for Jonah. The second method of God's grace, he's in at the moment of this prayer. The fish, the huge fish, was a method of God's grace. Why? Because he even says, you protected my life. You snatched me from the jaws of death. So Jonah sees the fish as the second mode of God's grace. We wouldn't maybe think of it that way, but Jonah did. It's disgusting. It's unpleasant. It was lonely, but it was still God's grace. Proverbs 3:12 says it this way. He says, for the Lord corrects those he loves, just as a father corrects a child in whom he delights. It makes me think of the phrase, this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you, right? That's what that verse basically is saying. God's like, I don't want to have to do this, but you leave me no choice. And so God sometimes, again, in letting us do what we want, in extending that grace, it's a long journey back home sometimes. To fix what's been done is sometimes complicated. So there's a couple of things about God's grace. Sometimes God's grace, as we see here, can be seen as discipline. It's weird to think of those two as the same, but we see it here in the story very clearly. This is how we learn. It's how we grow. It's how we mature. It's God loving us, but sometimes it's tough love. Sometimes there are still lessons that we have to learn the hard way, and we'll get to that here in just a minute, which is actually the next thing. So I'm way ahead of myself. Good job, me. All right. So the other thing about God's grace is God's grace doesn't mean we automatically escape natural consequences. So God's grace will cover your sin, but there still may be consequences to live out because of that sin. Jonah ran. So just because Jonah runs and gets swallowed up, oh, all is forgiven now. Well, yes, God will forgive him, and God will still call him again, as we'll see next week, to do the mission I said the first time, right? That's grace. But he still has to deal with the consequences. He's still stuck in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. So just because God forgives doesn't mean there's still not a cleanup on aisle 12. And we have to do some elbow grease to clean up the mess that we made. There's still consequences to that. But here's two then always statements about God's grace, even being difficult, messy, uncomfortable, complicated. And that is this: God's grace is always loving. So don't mistake God's grace, even if it stings a little bit, as him punishing you. No, it's God saying, I still love you. I really have no reason to. If all things being considered, all things being equal, I have every right to shut you out, and yet I'm not willing to do that. Like, I've given you chance after chance and time after time here, Jonah. How many times do I have to get your attention before you learn? But yet he provides the storm to get him to think. He provides the whale or the fish to get him to stop and pray and reconsider his life plan for a couple days. It's God's grace. It's loving. God's saying, I'm still not through with you yet. I still haven't given up on you yet. Could I? Yes. Should I? Probably, but I'm not going to. I refuse to give up. The second always statement about God's grace is then, God's grace always beats the alternative. Was the belly of the fish, I keep saying belly, really weird. Why do I do that? The belly of the fish, was it a weird place to be in? Yeah, but it's better than death, right? Was that uncomfortable time in his life difficult to get through? Yeah, but it's better than maybe the alternative. So it's the same way with your life and my life. God's grace is sometimes like a little sting there. Woo, I don't want to do that, but it's better than the alternative. It's better than staying lost. It's better than wasting my life. It's better than dying in my sin. I'd rather have some course correction while I'm still on the journey than realize after I've crashed and burned, should have gone that way, but it's too late. It's God's grace, even the messy parts, even the complicated bits, even the parts that we don't want to deal with, or, oh, I don't like that, or God, you're punishing me. No, it's like, it's better than the alternative. So then the key as we close then, the last thing I want to mention as we're done here is, what do we do with grace then? Simple. We embrace grace. Embrace grace. We read Proverbs 3:12. Let's look at the verse above that and see what King Solomon has to say about that. Proverbs 3:11 and 12. He says, my child, don't reject the Lord's discipline, and don't be upset when he corrects you. For the Lord corrects those he loves, just as a father corrects a child in whom he delights. Embrace grace. As we're aware of our need for grace, we call out to God for it, and he extends it, even though there are sometimes prices to pay, things that we have to then deal with, collateral damage that we're responsible for, that sort of thing. But we need to embrace it, even when it's complicated, when it's messy, when it's embarrassing. Embrace grace. Don't resist the process that God's doing in your life. Even those dark moments that may be lonely, or maybe you're dealing with consequences of previous actions. If God's forgiven you, it's forgiven, but then that grace is a process. It's something that we have to live through and work through. So don't resist the process, and let's not quickly forget the lessons that we learn through that process of grace. Because then we're going to have to do it again, Rather not have to repeat that over and over. Unfortunately, again, Jonah doesn't learn his lesson for very long. As soon as he lands back out of the fish onto the land, we find he hasn't changed all that much, at least not for very long. And again, the point of Jonah is don't be like Jonah. Again, don't, he's a cautionary whale of a tale to not be like him. So instead, we want to let our story be a story that is full of grace, that I'm a work in progress. That's actually on the front door. If you, one of the front signs on the church, we're a work in progress, and so is our building, all right? So we did that by design, that we're not perfect people. We are all in need of grace. We're in the same boat together, okay? We're in need of God's grace. I'm still learning and growing. I still need God's guidance and discipline and even correction at times. And so my prayer is, and I hope your prayer then, even this morning, is I see my need for God's grace and I receive God's grace. I embrace this process of grace.